Okay, for today, I'm going to show you how the Phillips curve goes through the three phases, the Phillips phase, the stagflation phase, and the recovery phase, and how these relate to the aggregate supply and aggregate demand movements. So first, we're going to start off with our baseline situation. We're going to start with an economy that is performing in a recessionary gap. So to show you this recessionary gap, I'm going to find what the equilibrium level for the economy currently is. So let's start off with our economy functioning in an environment where there is intense deflation and a lot of unemployment going on. The numbers themselves are not necessarily as important. They're not, the model isn't really based around getting the most accurate numbers as it is based around showing you the direction of how these things change. I'm going to paste these values here so we can see how these impact our schedule. And we have our year one values now where there's deflation occurring and an intense amount of unemployment. The federal rate is at 2.16%. Real wages in the economy are at $28.13. I'm putting these in here so you can keep track of how these values change as we shift things. There were no changes in government spending this year. Perfect, beautiful. Now let's say that this environment is concerning the Federal Reserve and they want to create more expansionary policy to, or they want to stimulate the economy through expansionary policy, such as cutting their federal funds rate. Let's say they do this by cutting their federal funds rate to 1.5%, injecting $65 billion into the economy and reducing the rates that are connected to the federal funds rate. So the 10-year treasury yield drops to 1.82% and the 30-year mortgage drops to 3.58%. Now let's figure out what the equilibrium is for the economy in this environment. With the Federal Reserve cutting rates, we should expect some level of inflation to occur. We see that the new level for the economy is $18.3 trillion. I'm going to copy these values for our level of, and for our PCE values and our unemployment levels. I'm going to paste this in here so we can see how this has impacted these other values here. Okay, so now we see that we have gone from a deflationary environment to inflation of 7.5%, right? With unemployment going down from 30% to 12.9% to 13%. The federal funds rate now is at 1.5%, and real wages in the economy should be lower now, and they are. The real wages in this year are now $26.25. We're going to paste that here. And what this all does is that it should shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, which is what we saw happen. The previous level of output in the economy was lower than what we're looking at now at the $18.3 trillion. But this is still probably not enough to get us across our potential output line, which is over here. So we know that the economy still needs some level of stimulation. Let's say the Federal Reserve is looking at it and saying the exact same thing. They're actually getting far more alarmed, and over the next year, they bring down federal funds rate a full percentage point. So now we're talking about federal funds rate being at 0.5%. Oh, on a percentage. Nope, that's 50. We're talking about 0.5%. Okay, and bring down the federal funds rate to 0.5% brings the 30-year mortgage down to 3%. 10-year treasury down to 1.32. Let's see what the new balance for the economy is. There should be some more inflation occurring in this new state for the economy. So we're going to do one. All right. Now, if we were to follow this, perfect. Okay. So it seems like the Federal Reserve is starting to achieve its goals. Let's put these numbers in and see how unemployment behaves. Face values. Okay. So we are seeing a predictable change based on the original understanding of the Phillips curve, a predictable change or trade-off between unemployment and inflation, right? Before I put those in, let me just make sure that I putting in the correct values for what the Federal Reserve Fed rate is, 5%. And now let's just make sure we know what real wages are. Real wages. Copy that over into a Phillips curve, into our Phillips curve schedule. Okay, so we're seeing this predictable trade-off, right? As unemployment decreases, going from 30% to 13% to 0, we see inflation picking up from deflation of 12% to inflation of 7.5% to inflation now of 8%. So we're getting pretty high levels of inflation now, and we're starting to see real wages decrease dramatically. And this is giving us a very, at first, normal looking Phillips curve where we go from year 1 to year 2 to year 3. It's kind of this shape that we're used to, this bowed in negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. But let's say that something occurs in year 4 where workers see real wages declining so substantially that they decide to try to organize for more wages, and successfully do in year 4 for the economy. So we can represent that by changing this part of the model from a baseline hourly wages of $25. Let's change that to $27. Now you see when we change that, it will change the cost of labor in the economy. If you look at the cost of labor here, when I undo this, cost of labor originally was at $4 billion. It goes up to $4.1 billion, right? Okay. And let's make sure that negotiation was actually successful in raising their real wage above where it was before. And yes, it is. At $26.16, that is a higher value for real wages than what's going on in year 3. So we're going to paste that value here. The federal funds rate did not change, so we're still talking about 0.5%. Perfect. And now let's find out what the new equilibrium level of output is for the economy. So that change in real wages results in an increase in unemployment as well as inflation. And you'll see that once I put these values into our year 4. Yes. So we still see that inflation is growing in this economy, and maybe not even by enough, because the workers aren't going to just settle for $26. They're going to try to get back to their real wage value of closer to 28. We need the laborers to organize to try to get their wages back up to the values they were at before. So let's say even negotiate for 31. Eesh. That is high. Let's see, this should be good at 1.08. Okay. And now that labor market should have us at closer to 28.58. Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so 28.58. Let's copy those values now instead for year 4. Oh, undo that. Paste in actually just the value number. Now let's see how that negotiation for higher wages impacts actual economy. We see a dramatic increase in inflation and unemployment. I'll also paste these values in here. Okay, so year 4 sees what's more akin to stagflation occurring, right? We go from year 1 to year 2 to year 3. And although there's some level of a trade-off where, yes, inflation has slowed down and we would expect unemployment to increase, unemployment is increasing dramatically compared to how much inflation has slowed down. It's not really a linear relationship. It's almost as if the Phillips curve is now, like we see in the textbook, twirling back, right? Going from here to here and then twirling right back around, which is more akin to what happens in the real world. It's not a perfect swirl, but it's very close to one. Okay, so this concerns policymakers in the federal government. Let's assume that the Federal Reserve has enough foresight to understand that cuts in rates would only beef up inflation even more. So this has to be a job for the fiscal side of things. Let's say that we do some intense stimulus here and we do around $2 trillion worth of stimulus into the economy, and we pay for about half of that with a hike in taxes. So 0.0 3, I'm pretty sure, would be not even half. We pay for like a quarter of that with a hike in taxes. Let's see how that would impact where our economy lands. Okay, perfect, perfect, perfect. Let's see how this impacts unemployment. And okay, all right. Let's see how these values work in this Phillips schedule. I'm going to paste these in. And what we see is that there is, okay, this is akin to the type of recovery that you would expect to occur. Let's see how the real wages are impacted. Okay, cool, cool. We'll copy these over, pay special. And now we know that we have 2 trillion worth of new spending occurring from the government side. And this is more or less what ends up happening with the Phillips curve and the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. So we see for points 1 through 3, 1, 2, and 3, there's a typical relationship where inflation increases at the same time that unemployment decreases. But this decrease in unemployment and this increase in inflation eats into real wages for workers. So after some point, workers start to demand wages closer to what they had started off with in their real terms. That demand for higher wages, though, eats into the unemployment gains, as in the gains in employment. So with this increase in real wages, we see a dramatic increase in unemployment. And at the same time, inflation continues to occur. So there isn't really this increase in unemployment with, like, yes, there's a drop in the level of inflation that's occurring. Like the change in price levels between year 3 and 4 is lower at 4.7%, but it's the fact that we're still increasing prices that is concerning to folks. At the same time that unemployment is increasing dramatically. This isn't a one-for-one trade-off, right? At 4.7% unemployment, 4.7% inflation, we shouldn't be seeing more unemployment than we saw with deflation occurring. So this concerns policymakers even more because prices are going up at the same time that unemployment's going up. In that case, we would expect fiscal policy to step in, which would have maybe less of a inflationary effect, as fiscal policy can also use taxing powers to pay for some of its expenditures. And that is what it does. It spends $2 trillion, increases taxes at the same time modestly to pay for some of that. And that brings down unemployment and slows down inflation even further. If we were to just look at the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves, right, there's a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve in every year after the first year until year 4. Year 4, we assume that the aggregate supply curve just shifts to the left. It contracts, which is because the cost of labor goes up in year 4. But then the rightward shift continues for the aggregate demand curve because of the increase in government spending in year 5. And all that recreates a twirl pattern for the Phillips curve, going from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 to year 4 and then year 5. Year 1, 2, and 3 is the Phillips phase. From year 3 to year 4 is the stagflation phase. And from year 4 to year 5 is the recovery phase. And notice in the recovery phase, inflation slows down at the same time the unemployment decreases. So I know these aren't precise figures, and this is probably more akin to what is happening in the real world in some ways because it's never as neat in the real world as it is in your textbook. But hopefully this illuminates what's going on as far as how changes in aggregate demand and in some ways changes in aggregate supply play out in the Phillips curve as far as the relationship between inflation and unemployment.